Welcome back to Deck Check MTG. I'm Ganesh, and I'm a little smaller than usual because I'm joined by Temujin and DX Reaper, the creators of a potential new Tier 1 deck, Fransisco Thrasios. I promise this isn't clickbait. This deck got 2 top 16s recently in the Lotus Series 2, and the future for Frank Thras is looking very bright. As usual, the deck list will be linked in the description. So, why should we play Fransisco Thrasios?
Well, I think the deck has the ability to play on, a lot of different planes of the game, if that makes sense. We're able to take advantage of the somewhat more mid-range game plan that most decks are on in the meta currently. And we have the ability to just, I guess you'd say, like, turn on the switch, right? And go from 0 to 100 faster than a lot of decks that are, in similar color schemes. I really like being the least shiny person at the table. I think there's something really to be said about feeling like you're not a threat and making it known that you're not a threat and then untapping and winning the game. That's a very unique ability that this deck has.
Yeah, we should probably explain what this deck does, or like what the commanders do. Fransisco has ability where whenever one or more pirates, they deal damage to someone, the pirate himself explores. So you look at the top card of your deck. If it's a land, you can put it in your hand. Otherwise, you just put a +1/+1 counter on it on Fransisco. And then Thrasios, we all know, has his activated ability and is a colorless infinite mana outlet as well. Yeah, so how does this deck combo/win? So notably, even though we are in blue-black, we are not on Thoracle. Why is that?
Well, I will start by saying we are by no means saying don't run Thoracle combo. Obviously, it's a very good combo, very mana efficient. It's the best combo in the meta. We get that. That's not the issue. In early playtesting, we had an issue where the cards were just dead way too often, and it was quite frustrating. Because our early game is so important to us that having dead cards that, like, we just want to bottom at some point, right? It gets very frustrating, and we need to get going with our value engines really fast. And so we replaced it with a more synergistic and less dead combo, all right? And by doing that, we put in Devoted Druid and Machine God's Effigy. So Devoted Druid is a 0/2 mana dork for 2 mana. Obviously not the best mana dork in the world. However, it doesn't die to Bowmasters, right? And that's a very prevalent part of the meta right now.
True.
Very, very frustrating. Doesn't die to Bowmasters, at least immediately. And it's easily tutorable with all of our creature tutors, same with Thoracle, but the main difference is the Machine God's Effigy, right? We're already running the Fransisco package, right? We got our Walking Ballista, and we have our Agatha's Soul Cauldron. We'll talk about that later. Both of those are artifacts, and so we're running our Transmute artifact, we're running our War of Invention, we're running these artifact tutors for that combo, and so having another combo that synergizes with the tutors that we're going to use is very important, and this also goes into the Kin and Basalt. So all of these, although they're not layered combos, they're very synergistic with the rest of the deck, and it creates a situation where we have less dead cards more often, which means we're able to decide when we want to win, we're able to use the window when we want to use it, because we always have something set up, right? It's very easy to just play out a Devoted Druid and pass the turn. No one's gonna go kill the Devoted Druid. Someone might kill a Kinnan, it happens from time to time, but also people aren't very afraid of Kinnan unless Kinnan is the commander.
Right.
And so it allows us to pull up these very unassuming board states, and then the synergy works out and you win the game.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense, because like Thoracle, you don't cast unless you have the other half of the combo, and Demonic Consultation, Tainted Pact, you're not really happy about ever casting those cards as like a tutor, right?
Yeah, not very often, no.
Yeah. Okay. So next up we have Soul Cauldron and Ballista. So yeah, let us know how this combo actually works.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple. Essentially, we want to get the Cauldron on the battlefield, the Fransisco on the battlefield, and the Ballista in the graveyard. You exile the Ballista with the Cauldron. You target Fransisco with the Reflective trigger, which is important. It's actually 2 triggers, one to exile and then one to put the 1/1 counter on it. You remove the counter, activating the Walking Ballista ability newly acquired. Reveal the top card of your library because you've done a point of damage, so you get to explore. As long as it's not a land, you go infinite.
Right.
Having a way to manipulate your top deck is great, but because we're playing Thrasios, and Thrasios loves to just get lands out of his deck, I mean, that's what he does, right? The deck ends up having, 60 cards, 10 lands sometimes by the time you're able to do this combo. So it's like, even when you're not manipulating your top deck, your odds of hitting a non-land card are so much higher than hitting a land. Between all the fetches and, the...
Right. I was going to say, yeah, it might be a good idea to have a fetch land up if you are trying to go for this combo.
Right, and something to note as well is you gain both abilities from Ballista, so you can actually give yourself extra 1/1 counters, and that's why we're playing cards like Training Grounds, even though it looks like it's a Thrasios card for most of the game, and it is. But when the Ballista ability hits the field, now you can put a 1/1 counter on your Fransisco and give him another activation, right? Or at that point, if he's been on the field already and he doesn't have Summoning Sickness, you can go to combat, get another activation, get another counter, right? So sometimes you're able to do it 4 or 5 times in a single turn. And, because you're already trying to make as much permanent mana as possible because of the Thrasios game plan, it really bodes well to that turn when you can win, because you're able to just guarantee it by putting an extra counter or 2 on him before you activate.
Something else to note is it's pretty easy to get Ballista in the graveyard because you can just cast it for 0 if you want. If that's where you need it to be, it'll just immediately die.
Yep, and we utilize that. We can talk about it a little bit later, but with Born Upon a Win, that's why we're able to win when we want to win instead of, when someone else is passing the turn to us. But, just casting the Ballista is so incredibly difficult to deal with. There's almost no interaction for somebody to have that's going to stop the actual cast of Ballista or exile the Ballista, besides the Mindbreak Trap and, you really play around it,
I guess. Yeah.
Things that aren't super common in our meta currently.
That makes sense. Okay, so next up we have Kinnan and Basalt. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory. I'm sure we've all seen this. These 2 cards combined will make infinite colorless mana for our Thrasios, and we'll win after that.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I mean, also it's worth noting the synergistic part. You can play both of them out, and they're good by themselves. Basalt, not so good by itself. However, with Seedborn Muse, it's pretty good, and we'll talk about that in our game plan area.
Okay. All right, so yeah, what is your game plan as Fransisco Thrasios?
Well, that is pretty simple. We are trying to establish early mana in the first turn or 2 and resolve a Seedborn Muse. That is our main game plan. Seedborn Muse is what brings us to victory. We have a lot of protection for it. And we just want to sit there and activate Seedborn Muse. We have multiple ways to try to win the game at instant speed. We have our Emergence Zone, we have our Crop Rotation, we have our Born Upon the Win, and then we have our War of Invention and Court of Calling. So as I was talking about earlier, our unassuming board states, right? We can play out our Devoted Druid, we can play out our Kinnan, we can play out our Basalt, we can play out our Cauldron even, and just sit there. And eventually, someone's going to try to win the game. And when someone tries to win the game, we do this cool little thing where we sandbag. We sandbag and we sandbag. And then eventually, there's a point where everyone's used they've used their interaction, or there's only one player, the player trying to win the game, who has the interaction left. And so you get into a 1v1 situation where you get to just cast your chord, get whatever A plus B, or your War of Invention, get whatever A plus B you are lacking, and you're in a 1v1 situation. And if you win, you make your infinite mana, you win on top.
Right.
And so we're really trying to take advantage of winning second. I think that's really important to note. Also, there's all kinds of opportunities where people tap out, and the only thing that's going to stop you is some sort of free interaction. And so I think this deck probably takes advantage of that better than just about any other deck in the format, especially with all the protection that we have with our permanent-based combos, right? We have our Spellskite. It's been pretty nice for me. Obviously able to protect your Kinnan and your Fransisco and your Devoted Druid.
Right.
And then you have Legolas's Quick Reflexes. That card has been absolute. That card is.
Yeah, I want to chime in and just say, what a ridiculous card. I cannot believe how effective it's been in so many board states. Just crazy good, dude.
All right, so
Sure.
yeah, I think we've gone over a little bit of this already, but in the early game, you said, right, you're just trying to develop your mana. In the mid game, you are looking to keep your Seedborn Muse alive. What do you try to do to the late game? You're just waiting for a stack war and then try to win on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, like he was saying, we just try to win second in the late game. Generally, we can close it out in the mid game. If the Seaborn resolves and we have a piece of protection in our hand, it's almost unbeatable. All you need is the protection for the turn you play the Seedborn, because once you untap, it's just so hard to deal with.
Right.
I will say, though, the game plan isn't always going to work. Sometimes you misread a board state and you play out your Seedborn, and now you're the target, but you don't have enough protection in your hand. And,
Right.
You have to kind of go with the flow, if you will, and make sure you're taking advantage of somebody else being just a little more threatening than you. And the mid game is basically try to sandbag, like you were saying. I mean, I hate to say, I hate being that guy, right? But I think people use interaction on unnecessary spells a lot, and it sounds like a bad thing when you say sandbag, but really I don't need to interact until the spell says win the game, right? If the spell doesn't say win the game, and I'm not in a position where it's going to put me so far behind that it's insurmountable, then there's no reason for me to interact. I think the biggest culprit of this is like seeing a Ristic Study or a Fish or something like that, right? A lot of people jump the gun, and it's, if I'm playing against two Jund decks and a Timnachrom, I'm not going to counter his Fish. Like, I'm good, Like, it's just not as threatening as it appears on the stack, I think in practice, card quality matters a lot, and if they're drawing a bunch of counter spells, I'm not going to play anything that's worth countering until somebody else has already gone through that process. So
Right.
keeping the interaction to protect your own win is sometimes the right play, or using it at the very last possible minute is sometimes the right play. But I think jumping the gun is what we see a lot in the meta right now, and that's something that this deck just can't afford to do.
Okay.
If that makes sense. And
Yeah, it
then
does.
the late game is essentially we've accumulated so much value that there's just no way to lose, is how I feel, And I'm sure I'm wrong, but I don't know if I've gotten to a late game board state that I felt was, I was just out of the game. I don't think that's ever happened.
Okay. All right. So, what are some tips you'd give new players that are new to Fransisco Thrasios in general?
Specific to Fransisco Thrasios, I think it's very important to note that our early game is rough. We're in blue, so we have Mystic Remora and Ristic Study. We don't have red and we don't have white, and I think red and white, red makes up for early game being rough by having Dockside. White does it by having some of the best early game plays in the game, right? They have the Esper Sentinels and some of the best stacks pieces that you can play on turn one. We have Mana Dorks. I hate Mana Dorks. They're trash. I don't like them. But that's what we got. So besides playing the Ristic Study and the Mystic Remora, we have Manglehorn, and attempting to put mana out on the board. So I think it's very important to mull for your game plan. You're going to get into games where you're going to see two turbo players. You can't sit there and mull for interaction. You're not going to win that game. You can't do it. You can attempt to win faster than them, and it is possible. There are a lot of combinations of cards that allow you to win on turn 2. I've done it many times, and it is effective, and they're hard to interact with. Creatures and artifacts, extremely hard to interact with, especially on turn 2. So just mull for your game plan. Do your thing. Don't worry about the rest of the table. When you get to turn 3, then you can start worrying about the rest of the table. That's what I personally recommend.
Okay. All right. So yeah, how do you feel this deck is positioned in the meta in general right now?
Yeah, I think he has a little bit more experience with the tournament meta. But I have just a ton of games on the deck, and I think it does really well against blue farm, which is like what, 25 to 30% of the meta, I would say. So I think when we talk about the meta, we talk about blue farm, right? And having the same, pace as blue farm and being able to just kind of, I mean, the deck can almost play identical to blue farm. I will say Tymna Crom much better than Thrasios Fransisco in terms of raw value in the command zone. But you do have some stuff that they don't have, mainly being like the ability to just empty the board state with Culling Ritual. I think that card is a meta breaking card. That's how I would put it. It absolutely destroys Kennen. I think I talked about it with Max a little bit, and he said there's like 3 permanents he could care about after a Culling Writ. All those big creatures that you think are like scary after Culling Writ are actually almost dead, because you win, right? Like if he has a Sphinx, that's great, but I just wiped the board and I have 14 mana. I'm winning the game,
Right.
And in combination with Mnemonic Betrayal, it creates these scenarios that are just unbeatable. Like the worst case scenario is like you don't win the game, but you have 15 mana and you've tutored 3 times and you just pass the turn and you're like, okay, if you can win, good luck, but I tutored for interaction because look at my board state. I think Culling Ritual, meta breaking, that's how I would say how it's positioned pretty high, and specifically because of that card.
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, what are some other important cards in this list? So I see we have Seedborn here, and we also have Force of Vigor. So Seedborn we already talked about, but how does Force of Vigor do in general?
Backtracking to us having a rough early game, besides our Mystic Gamora and Rhystic Study, Force of Vigor is a really good equalizer. I just talked about how I hate mana dorks, while I love pitching them the Force of Vigor. So if you're in that 4th position, you're in that 3rd position, you see Mystic Gamora on the 1st player, Rhystic Study on the 2nd player, it's the greatest equalizer. You just wipe it, go to your turn, you have nothing to worry about. I think the card's definitely undervalued in green decks. It's worth noting that this is a Simic plus black deck, and so we have no issue finding cards to pitch to that. And yeah, I've been extremely impressed with it, especially on winning turns, where you're like, all right, I'm gonna start my interaction war with this Force of Vigor to remove your 2 draw engines. So hopefully you don't draw into more gas, and it works out pretty well.
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, we talked a little bit about Legolas's Quick Reflexes and Spellskite already, so we don't need to go over those again. And then yeah, War of Mention and Court of Calling, these both basically just enable instant speed wins, right? So if you already have like a Kinnan or the other piece of your AB combos, you just go and grab the other one with these at instant speed.
Well, it's not just that. Yes, they enable our instant speed wins, but it's extremely relevant to pull up the fact that they're interaction. Those 2 spells are interaction, right? You have a clone at 2 CMC for Court of Calling on Flesh Duplicate, and you have one at 4 CMC with Metamorph, less likely to be fetched with it. You also have Gilded Drake, you have Bowmasters, you have Spellskite, you have Endurance, you have Manglehorn, and you have Opposition Agent. You have a lot of targets for interaction. You can't always just win the game, and sometimes these can be really big blowouts, especially fetching a clone to, let's say someone casts an Atraxa, you Chord Calling on top of their ETB, you get their Atraxa trigger on top of them. It's kind of cool, done it before. Also, there's Gilded Drake, taking someone's Kinnan, Wincon, blah, 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 blah. The same thing applies to War of Invention on Spellskite, Metamorph, and then also Agatha's Soul Cauldron, surprisingly interaction. Who knew? Stops Breach sometimes.
Right.
It hurts them pretty good, pretty relevant. So making sure that your win cons are also utility, pretty important.
I'd like to add to the Agatha's interaction thing. Something I've been doing a lot lately is they crack Ranger Captain, and with the activation on the stack, I look for Agathas. I exile their Ranger Captain with my Agathas, give one of my creatures the +1/+1 counter, and crack a Ranger Captain in response to their Ranger Captain. I've done it,
spicy.
dude. I've done it so many times. At this point, the play pattern just feels wonderful. You're like, okay, Ranger Captain is good for me, you know, like I'm gonna respond to. I mean, it feels so much like a blowout, and then all of your creatures eventually become Ranger Captains. Because yeah, you know, we're just activating the Agathas over and over as many times as we can at that point. The Bowmaster's token is always a Ranger Captain, so anytime someone's drawing an extra card, you're making an extra Ranger Captain.
God,
pretty good.
I forgot about that. Yeah, the Orc army is always whatever Soul Cauldron.
Yeah,
right?
I think Soul Cauldron is really highlighted in this deck. It feels wonderful to do like the most obscure plays, like exiling a Bloom Tender from the Kennan's graveyard, and suddenly you have 3 Bloom Tenders and a Kennan in board, and you're making 4 mana per Bloom Tender. Giving your creatures all the Devoted Druid ability is really nifty. The token gets pretty big from the Orc army. We've all seen that, right? Getting up to 15, 16. Well, when it becomes a Devoted Druid, it makes dumb mana, just an insane amount of mana. I've gotten 20, 30 mana before. I think Temu won just from Finale of Devastation on like X equals 15 or something, and he didn't have infinite mana. He just had a bunch of mana. It was enough, you know. So sometimes just making a lot is enough, and I think Blue Farm really highlights that with like the recent includes we've seen of like Smothering Tithe, where they don't need to make infinite mana, they just make enough mana.
Right. Okay, so what decks does Frank Thrasios struggle against? So I know we've mentioned turbo decks. Is that mainly it?
Yep, that's the only thing. That literally, as I said before, our turn 1 and turn 2 suck. Besides the normal blue things that you can do, or the normal nut hands that every deck can get, there's no rhymer consistency that our deck has on turn 1 and turn 2, besides trying to lay out mana. And so the only decks that are able to give us the hardest time is turbo decks, because we just don't have the ability to be worried about them all of the time. Sometimes we get lucky, we have the answer. Doesn't always happen. They're gonna get under us sometimes, and you just have to accept that and move on to the next game. It's important to note that this deck is better in the mid-range meta, and as the meta becomes more mid-range, this deck becomes better, and it is only going to struggle against the turbo decks. So as long as you don't see those, you should be all right.
Okay. So as a caveat to that, what cards does this deck struggle against specifically? And we have Cursed Totem as a good example, right?
Yeah, I think Cursed Totem is so rare right now, we don't see it. But I do play against a lot of the same players, and I have seen them start slotting this card in a little bit more. I've seen it a few times now. I've seen decks that utilize it a little better. Maybe with the return of Tie-Am, we start seeing maybe not this card specifically, but a lot more artifact hate in general, which doesn't put us out of the game like it does most decks, because we do have Gaias, and a lot of these dorks he was talking about hating are really good against Stacks decks. I think they they kind of make the difference. If that, like, why is Kennen okay with playing against the Stacks deck and Blue Farm isn't, right? And it's because of the way Kennen makes mana, and we're similar to that. We can get under a lot of decks with like our Kennen activation too, which is surprisingly effective. You'd be surprised how many times I'm just like, I could spin Thrasios once, or I could spin Kennen once, and in this board state, I think hitting a Gilded Drake or a clone kind of just wins me the game. So I'm gonna spin Kennen, and it's uncounterable. I mean, essentially, right?
Yeah, right.
So, paying 7 mana for a clone isn't great, but like he was saying, when you're doing it on top of an Atraxa ETB, it feels pretty good. It does what it needs to do. But yeah, I think the big thing is against Stacks decks, we don't struggle too much, but against specific Stacks pieces, we might have a little bit harder of a time than some decks do.
Right.
Notably pieces that you just don't see that often, like the Graveyard Hate and the Cursed Totem, or I don't know, even the ETB effects aren't that bad. Everything is kind of mid against us, I would say, except for specifically this card, because all of our combos require us to be able to activate creatures.
Okay. Well, that was excellent. Thank you very much to y'all two. And thanks very much to my patrons. And subscribe, check out the Discord. I'll see you later.